Somewhere in the deserts of Iraq, a column of American soldiers is pinned down. Enemy fighters are pouring out of a building 300 meters away. Mortars are walking toward them. The radio crackles. Someone calls it in. And then, a sound. A sound that every American ground soldier who has ever heard it in combat says is the most beautiful sound on earth. A low, guttural roar. A silhouette dropping out of the sky like a flying tank. The BRRRT of a 30-millimeter rotary cannon firing at 4,000 rounds per minute. And just like that, the threat is gone. The soldiers are alive. And at the center of this moment is an aircraft that the United States Air Force has been trying to get rid of for 30 years. This is not just a story about one airplane. This is a story about a war that never ends. Not between nations, but between the United States Army and the United States Air Force. A war over doctrine, over control, over who owns the sky when soldiers are dying on the ground beneath it. It is a war that has been fought in jungles, deserts, the mountains of Afghanistan, the corridors of the Pentagon, the chambers of Congress, and it is being fought right now, today, in 2026. The question at the heart of this war is deceptively simple. When American soldiers need air support, who is responsible for giving it to them? And how it gets answered, or fails to get answered, has cost American lives in every major conflict since the Second World War. This is the story of close air support, the eternal Army versus Air Force shootout. And it goes much deeper, much darker, and much further back than most people ever imagine. Let us start at the very beginning. Because to understand why this fight exists, you have to understand where the Air Force came from and what it believed it was for. For most of the first half of the 20th century, there was no United States Air Force. There were the Army Air Corps and later the Army Air Forces, aviation branches that existed to support land warfare. And in the years leading up to the Second World War, a generation of aviation theorists developed an idea that would shape everything that followed. The idea was called strategic bombing. The idea was that air power was not just a support tool for ground troops. It was an independent, war-winning weapon in its own right. If you could build enough bombers and fly them deep enough into the enemy's territory, you could destroy his factories, his railroads, his oil refineries, his cities, and you could win a war without needing a massive ground army to slug it out in the mud. This idea was seductive. It promised clean victory from altitude. It promised to make the kind of industrialized slaughter of the First World War obsolete. And the men who believed in it most passionately, men like General Hap Arnold, like Billy Mitchell before him, fought with extraordinary intensity to build an independent air service that could pursue this vision without being subordinated to the demands of ground commanders who just wanted air cover for their infantry. In 1947, they got what they wanted. The National Security Act created the United States Air Force as a fully independent service, co-equal with the Army and the Navy. The airmen had their independence. They had their doctrine. And almost from day one, this created a problem that has never been fully resolved. Because the Army was still there, and the Army still needed air support. The tension goes back even further than 1947. Go back to the Second World War, and you see the CAS problem in its earliest modern form. In North Africa, in the early campaigns of 1942 and 1943, the lack of proper air-ground coordination was a disaster. American ground commanders had air support that was inadequate, poorly coordinated, and almost totally ineffective at the critical moments when they needed it most. The British had learned painful lessons early in the war about how to integrate air and ground power, and American forces had to learn the same lessons the same hard way. But by 1944, a transformation had taken place. General Pete Quesada, commanding the 9th Tactical Air Command in Europe, built something genuinely revolutionary. A system of forward air controllers who flew with the ground forces, who understood the ground battle, who could talk aircraft onto targets in real time. Quesada put radios in tanks. He put liaison officers in armored formations. He created the kind of seamless air-ground integration that infantry commanders dream about. And the results were extraordinary. In the breakout from Normandy, in the drive across France, American ground forces had air support that was responsive, accurate, and lethal. The Typhoons and Thunderbolts overhead became an extension of the ground battle, not a separate phenomenon happening in the sky. It worked. And then the war ended. And the Air Force, newly independent and hungry to pursue its strategic vision, essentially abandoned everything Quesada had built. This is the first great betrayal in the history of close air support. The lessons learned in Blood and Fire in France and Germany, the doctrine, the tactics, the training, the culture of air-ground cooperation, were discarded almost immediately after 1945. The Air Force was focused on the nuclear mission. Strategic Air Command, under Curtis LeMay, was the glamorous, powerful, well-funded crown jewel of the new service. Tactical Air Command, which was responsible for the CAS mission among other things, was an afterthought. It was underfunded. Its doctrine was neglected. Its aircraft were increasingly multi-role platforms optimized for nuclear weapons delivery, not for flying low and slow over a battlefield and killing tanks. The lesson of Pete Quesada was allowed to rot. And within 5 years, this institutional amnesia would have consequences measured in American lives. Korea, June 1950. North Korean forces pour across the 38th parallel and drive the United States and South Korean forces to the edge of destruction at the Pusan perimeter. American soldiers are desperate for air support, and the Air Force, the independent service that had promised it could win wars from the air, was struggling to provide effective close air support. Part of the problem was doctrinal. The Air Force believed, institutionally, in centralized control of air assets. Theater air commanders wanted to allocate air power according to their own priorities, which were not always the priorities of the brigade commander whose men were being overrun. The system was slow. It was bureaucratic. By the time a CAS request worked its way up through the chain and back down to a controller, the tactical situation had often changed completely. And the aircraft being used were often not optimized for the mission. The jets of the early 1950s were designed for speed, for altitude, for nuclear delivery, not for the low, slow, deliberate business of supporting infantry in contact. Meanwhile, the Marine Corps, which had never abandoned the principle that aviation existed primarily to support the ground battle, was performing extraordinary close air support, flying propeller-driven Corsairs from carriers and forward airstrips in direct, responsive, and lethal support of Marine ground forces. The contrast was stark. Marine commanders praised their aviation. Army commanders complained about theirs. And the Air Force, after Korea, did what it had done after World War II. It looked at the lessons, decided they were anomalous, and went back to focusing on the nuclear mission. During the Korean War period in the 1950s, the Army began to understand something with absolute clarity. It could not rely on the Air Force to prioritize close air support. The Air Force was always going to have other priorities: strategic bombing, nuclear deterrence, air superiority. And when those priorities competed with the needs of soldiers on the ground were going to lose. So the Army began looking for alternatives. It looked at helicopters. In the early 1960s, the Army's aviation revolution began to take shape. Helicopter doctrine was developed and tested at Fort Rucker. The air assault concept, pioneered by General Harry Kennard and the men who would form the 1st Cavalry Division, imagined a battlefield where helicopters provided not just transport and reconnaissance, but direct fire support for infantry. The UH-1 Iroquois, the Huey, became the symbol of this revolution. And the Army began developing the AH-56 Cheyenne, an advanced attack helicopter that was, frankly, a direct attempt to develop an organic air support capability that did not depend on the Air Force at all. The Army was solving its CAS problem by building its own solution. And the Air Force noticed. What followed was one of the most fascinating institutional power struggles in American military history. The Air Force looked at what the Army was doing and understood the threat immediately. If the Army developed its own fixed-wing or high-performance attack aircraft, the rationale for a separate Air Force providing tactical support would be undermined. In 1966, the Johnson-McConnell Agreement was reached between Army Chief of Staff Harold K. Johnson and Air Force Chief of Staff John P. McConnell. The agreement was breathtakingly simple in its logic and deeply political in its execution. The Army would give up fixed-wing tactical aircraft and confine itself to helicopters. The Air Force would take responsibility for the fixed-wing close air support mission. Both services would get their priorities funded. It was a deal, not a doctrinal solution, a political deal, and it shaped everything that followed. The Army got its attack helicopter program, eventually producing the AH-1 Cobra and later the iconic H-64 Apache. The Air Force got, on paper, responsibility for the fixed-wing CAS mission. And Congress, watching the Army's Cheyenne program struggle technically and financially, used the existence of the Air Force's new commitment to CAS as justification to cancel the Cheyenne in 1972. The Army had traded away its organic fixed-wing CAS capability in exchange for helicopter authority. And the Air Force, having made the deal, then had to actually deliver on it. This is where the A-10 Warthog enters the story. And the story of how the A-10 was born is itself a window into the institutional dysfunction at the heart of this entire debate. The Air Force, committed by the 1966 agreement to providing fixed-wing CAS, announced the AX program in 1966, a competition to develop the Air Force's first aircraft specifically designed from the ground up for close air support. Not a multi-role fighter, not a bomber with a secondary CAS capability, a purpose-built, dedicated close air support aircraft. The competition produced two competing designs, and in 1973 the Fairchild Republic Y-10 was selected over the Northrop YA-9. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, universally known as the Warthog, entered service in 1977. And it was remarkable, genuinely, honestly remarkable. Built around the Ju-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel 30mm rotary cannon so massive and powerful that the entire aircraft was essentially designed around the gun, the A-10 was unlike anything else in the Air Force inventory. It was not fast. Its top speed was around 439 miles per hour, subsonic, slow by any modern fighter standard. It was not stealthy. It was enormous, twin-engine, covered in rivets, aesthetically somewhere between a flying bathtub and a mechanical gargoyle. It was armored. The pilot sat in a titanium bathtub, a literal armored tub that could absorb hits from weapons up to 23 millimeters. Its engines were mounted high on the tail to reduce their infrared signature and to protect them from ground fire. Its hydraulic flight control systems were redundant, backed up by manual reversion. It could fly without hydraulics if it had to. It could fly on one engine. It could land on short, unprepared runways. It was designed to absorb damage that would destroy any other aircraft and keep flying. And it was designed to fly low, slow, and close to the ground, to put eyes on the battlefield, to work closely with forward air controllers, to deliver precise, sustained, lethal fire support to troops in contact. The soldiers loved it. From the moment the A-10 appeared over the modern battlefield, ground forces treated it with a reverence that bordered on devotion. In Operation Desert Storm in 1991, A-10s destroyed more Iraqi equipment than any other aircraft. Over 900 tanks, 2,000 military vehicles, 1,200 artillery pieces. They flew in conditions no other aircraft would attempt. They survived damage that should have killed them. They flew back to base with engines on fire, with holes in their wings, with hydraulic lines severed, with control surfaces shot away. The stories of A-10 survivability are almost mythological. One famous incident from Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003 involved an A-10 that took a direct hit from a missile that destroyed much of one wing, and the pilot flew it home. The Army loved the A-10 not just for what it did, but for what it represented. It was an Air Force aircraft that had been built specifically for them, built to be at their level, built to look them in the eye, metaphorically, from 50 feet above the ground rather than from 30,000 feet above them. And almost from the moment the A-10 entered service, the Air Force started trying to get rid of it. This is the second great institutional betrayal in the history of close air support. The pattern has repeated with stunning consistency across 70 years. The Air Force accepts responsibility for the CAS mission, sometimes under political pressure and sometimes through genuine doctrinal agreement, develops a capability, and then quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, tries to divest itself of that capability whenever budget pressure or institutional priorities provide the opportunity. In the 1980s, the Air Force proposed replacing the A-10 with a modified F-16, which it called the A-16. The Army was not amused. Congress was not amused. The proposal was killed. In the early 1990s, after Desert Storm's vindication of the A-10's combat effectiveness, the Air Force proposed retiring large portions of the A-10 fleet. Congress blocked it. In 2013, facing budget sequestration, the Air Force proposed retiring the entire A-10 fleet to save money. This produced one of the most spectacular institutional confrontations in recent Pentagon history. A-10 pilots defied orders and attended congressional hearings in their flight suits. Ground Force commanders testified about what the loss of dedicated CAS would mean for soldiers in contact. Senator John McCain, himself a Navy aviator and POW, savaged Air Force testimony. Congress blocked the retirement again, and the fight continued. As of today, in May 2026, the A-10 fleet is being drawn down. The Air Force has been retiring Warthogs at an accelerating pace. In fiscal year 2024 alone, 39 A-10s were sent to the boneyard at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. The fiscal year 2026 budget request proposed retiring all remaining aircraft. Congress, once again, has intervened, prohibiting the inventory from dropping below 103 aircraft. And the debate rages on, louder and more urgent than ever before. But let us be honest about the complexity here. Because the Air Force's argument for retiring the A-10 is not simply institutional indifference dressed up in strategic language. There is a real case, a serious case, and you need to understand it to understand why this argument is so hard to resolve. The core of the Air Force argument is survivability. The A-10 was designed to fly in a permissive or semi-permissive environment, one where the enemy has limited or no advanced air defenses. It was designed for a battlefield where anti-aircraft systems were radar-guided but manageable, where manpads, man-portable shoulder-fired missiles, were the primary threat. In that environment, it is extraordinary. But the modern battlefield has changed in ways that are genuinely alarming for low-slow aircraft. Russia's S-400 air defense system and its export variants can engage aircraft at ranges and altitudes that make the A-10's entire operating profile low, slow, close to the ground, suicidal. China's integrated air defense systems are among the most sophisticated ever developed. In a conflict with either of these near-peer adversaries, deploying A-10s would essentially be sending pilots to their deaths. The Air Force is not wrong about this. The Ukrainian conflict has provided a real-world data point. The Su-25, Russia's equivalent to the A-10 in role, if not in exact capability, has been shot down at alarming rates by Ukrainian air defenses on both sides of that conflict. Dedicated low-altitude attack aircraft are enormously vulnerable in modern high-threat environments. The question is not whether the A-10 would survive against Chinese or Russian integrated air defenses. It almost certainly would not. The question is what comes after it. And here is where the Army's frustration becomes entirely legitimate and not at all merely parochial. The Air Force's answer to the post A-10 CAS problem is the F-35. And the F-35, for all its extraordinary capabilities as a multi-role platform, is not a CAS aircraft in the way the A-10 is a CAS aircraft. This is not about emotion or nostalgia. This is about physics and design philosophy. The A-10 carries more than 1,000 rounds for its GEU-8 cannon. The F-35 carries fewer than 200 rounds for its 25mm gun. The A-10 can loiter over a battlefield for extended periods, circling and waiting, watching, talking to controllers, working the target. The F-35 burns fuel at a rate that makes extended loitering expensive and eventually impossible. The A-10 is armored to survive ground fire. The F-35 is a stealth aircraft whose low observable coatings are sensitive to debris, to rain, to shrapnel. A lucky piece of shrapnel or a small arms round could compromise its stealth coating or its sensitive electronics. The F-35 costs approximately $34,000 to $36,000 per flight hour to operate. The A-10 costs approximately $18,000. In a sustained counterinsurgency or counterterrorism operation, the kind of conflict the United States has actually been fighting for 25 years. Using F-35s to provide close air support is like using a Formula One car to plow a field. It can technically do it, but it is wildly expensive, inefficient, and you are destroying something precious every time you use it that way. And the Army knows this. And the Army is furious. And the soldiers on the ground know this. And they are more than furious. There is a cultural dimension to this fight that is just as important as the tactical one. And it goes to the heart of what the CAS mission actually requires. Close air support is not just a weapons delivery problem. It is a relationship problem. Effective CAS requires pilots who understand the ground battle, who understand how infantry moves, how armor advances, how fire and maneuver works, who can look at a map with a ground controller and immediately visualize what he is describing, who fly at altitudes where they can actually see the battlefield with their own eyes, not just through a sensor feed on a screen. This kind of understanding is not acquired automatically by being a fighter pilot. It is built through years of training alongside ground forces, through joint exercises, through a culture that values the ground battle as much as it values the air battle. The A-10 community inside the Air Force built exactly this culture. A-10 pilots did not see themselves as fighter pilots who occasionally did CAS. They saw themselves as close air support specialists. They trained with the Army and Marine Corps constantly. They knew the ground battle. They were, in the words of many who served alongside them, more soldiers than airmen in their instincts and their priorities. When that community is dispersed, when those pilots transition to F-35s or F-15 E-S or other multi-role platforms, that culture does not automatically transfer. It goes with the people. And when the people are gone, rebuilding it takes years and blood. Vietnam provides the most painful example of what happens when air-ground coordination breaks down and when the services cannot agree on doctrine. In Vietnam, the Air Force initially wanted to fight the air war its way. High-altitude precision strikes against strategic targets in North Vietnam, strategic bombing campaigns, interdiction missions against supply lines. And simultaneously, it had an obligation to provide close air support to ground forces fighting a counterinsurgency in South Vietnam. It attempted to do both. And the result was a chaotic, inefficient, and ultimately damaging patchwork of doctrine, command structures, and competing priorities that no one managed particularly well. The Air Force favored centralized control of air assets, wanting theater air commanders to allocate aircraft according to broad strategic priorities. The Army wanted dedicated, responsive, decentralized support. Air on call, air that answered to the guy whose soldiers were in the grass, and not to a headquarters 50 miles away. Forward air controllers, pilots flying small, slow observation aircraft like the O-1 Bird Dog, and later the O-2 and OV-10, became the critical bridge between the two worlds. These men, flying almost unarmed over some of the most intense ground fighting of the war, directing fast movers onto targets that were sometimes within meters of friendly positions, were performing extraordinarily dangerous and critically important work. And they were never quite enough. The system was never quite right. The coordination was never quite seamless enough. And soldiers died in the gaps. The Marine Corps, throughout this entire history, offers a counterpoint that is embarrassing to the Air Force and deeply instructive for everyone. From the beginning of Marine Corps aviation doctrine, Marines understood that naval and aviation assets existed to support the ground battle. Full stop. The Marine Air Ground Task Force concept, in which aviation and ground forces are permanently integrated in the same organizational structure, means that Marine pilots train with Marine infantry from the very beginning of their careers. They know each other. They speak the same language. They trust each other. The Marine Corps settled the CAS debate within their own service decades ago, and the settlement was simple. Our aircraft exist to support our ground troops, and every Marine aviator knows it. In Korea, Marine CAS was consistently praised by Army ground commanders who experienced both it and Air Force CAS. In Vietnam, the same pattern repeated. In every major conflict since, Marine aviation has consistently provided more responsive, more accurate, and more lethal close air support than Air Force aviation. And the reason is institutional and cultural, not technical. The Marines did not have better aircraft. They had better doctrine. They had better integration. And they had a command culture that never allowed the aviators to forget their primary purpose. This brings us to what may be the deepest and most uncomfortable truth in this entire debate. The Army versus Air Force CAS fight is not primarily a fight about tactics or technology. It is a fight about institutional identity. The United States Air Force was created to pursue strategic air power, the independent use of aviation to achieve war aims directly, without dependence on ground forces. Close air support, by its very definition, makes the Air Force subordinate to the ground battle. It makes Air Force aircraft tools in someone else's strategy. And while the Air Force has never said this out loud in those precise terms, its institutional behavior over 70 years has consistently reflected the deep discomfort with that subordination. Every time budget pressure provides an excuse, the CAS-specific capabilities get cut. Every time resources are tight, the CAS training suffers first. Every time a new aircraft program is developed, the emphasis is on multi-role capability, on the ability to do everything from air superiority to strategic strike, and the dedicated, specialized, limited-role CAS platform is the first thing to be eliminated from the requirements list. And every time soldiers are pinned down somewhere and calling for air support, the gap between what the Air Force provides and what the Army needs becomes visible and painful. Let us look at specific moments where this gap cost lives. In the Korean War, during the desperate fighting around the Chosin Reservoir in November and December 1950, Marines were saved in large part by Marine aviation flying in appalling weather conditions in direct support of ground forces. Army units in similar situations with Air Force support fared worse. In Vietnam, the Battle of Ia Drang Valley in 1965, made famous by the book and film We Were Soldiers, saw Air Force, Navy, and Marine aircraft all providing CAS in an environment of desperate close combat. The coordination was often improvised, the doctrine was inconsistent, and the close calls were terrifying. In Mogadishu in 1993, during the Black Hawk Down incident, the absence of effective fixed-wing CAS, specifically the absence of an AC-130 gunship that had been recalled to base, was a factor in the catastrophic escalation of the firefight. In the mountains of Afghanistan in 2002, during Operation Anaconda, what was supposed to be a swift, clean operation turned into a brutal, sustained firefight in which ground forces desperately needed responsive air support, and the coordination problems between the services produced confusion, delays, and casualties. After Anaconda, a serious after-action effort was made to reform CAS doctrine and improve coordination. Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, JTACs, became the standard embedded air-ground liaison, replacing the older air liaison officer system with a more flexible, better-trained force. This was real progress, but it was progress achieved despite institutional resistance, not because of institutional enthusiasm. The JTAC story is worth examining in some detail because it illustrates how the system actually works in the modern era and why it still has structural problems. A JTAC, a Joint Terminal Attack Controller, is typically an enlisted or non-commissioned officer from the Army, Air Force, or Marine Corps who is trained to coordinate and control aircraft performing close air support, air interdiction, and other airstrikes. These men and women are extraordinarily capable. They are trained to communicate with pilots, to identify targets, to manage deconfliction, to call and fire with precision that can put ordnance within meters of friendly forces. In Iraq and Afghanistan, JTACs became some of the most valuable and most respected individuals on the battlefield. They were the link between the soldier on the ground and the aircraft overhead, and they saved countless lives. But the JTAC system is not a solution to the institutional problem. It is a workaround. It is an adaptation that allows the current system to function despite its structural deficiencies. The underlying tension between the Air Force's institutional priorities and the Army's operational needs does not go away because you have a very well-trained individual standing in the middle and translating between the two worlds. When the JTAC is present and the aircraft is overhead and the communication is working and the targets are clear, the system works beautifully. When any of those elements are degraded or absent, the system fails. And in war, elements are always degraded and absent. Now let us bring this story fully into the present, because the debate has never been more urgent than it is right now. The Air Force is in the process of retiring the A-10 fleet. In fiscal year 2024, 39 A-10s went to the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base Boneyard. The Air Force's fiscal year 2026 budget requested the retirement of all remaining aircraft. Congress, in the Senate Armed Services Committee's draft budget, is once again intervening, prohibiting the inventory from dropping below 103 aircraft. The total active fleet, which stood at 218 aircraft at the start of fiscal 2024, is being reduced year by year. The debate about what replaces it has never been satisfactorily answered. But here is the twist that nobody expected. Right now, in 2025 and 2026, the A-10 is not sitting in a museum waiting to die. It is deployed. It is fighting. A-10s are operating out of Jordan, flying missions over Syria against ISIS-related targets. They have been fitted with precision munitions, advanced precision kill weapons system rockets. They have been shooting down drones. One A-10, photographed at a CENTCOM base, bore two silhouettes of Shahid-type Iranian drones on its nose, kill markings. In the 2026 tensions with Iran, A-10s proved uniquely effective at destroying fast-attack naval vessels and providing close air support in complex environments. The aircraft that the Air Force has been trying to retire is still at war, still saving lives, still doing what no other aircraft in the inventory can do quite the same way. And what does the future hold? The Air Force's answer is the F-35 for the near term, and eventually next-generation platforms, possibly unmanned, possibly combined crewed unmanned teaming concepts for the longer term. The theory is that stealth, speed, and precision-guided munitions fired from standoff distances will replace the low, slow, and close approach that the A-10 represents. A future aircraft, or a future drone, might stand off at a safe distance, gather targeting data through advanced sensors, and deliver precise munitions without exposing itself to ground fire at all. This is a genuinely compelling vision for certain scenarios. Against a peer adversary with advanced integrated air defenses, it may be the only viable approach. But critics, And there are many serious ones, not just nostalgic A-10 lovers. Point out that this vision assumes a battlefield that looks like a high-end peer conflict. In the actual conflicts the United States has fought since 1945, Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Gulf War I, Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, most of them have been characterized by limited or non-existent enemy air defenses, complex close combat situations where precision and persistence matter more than stealth, and the critical importance of the psychological effect of a visible aircraft on the battlefield. Soldiers who see a Warthog overhead know they are not alone. There is a measurable, though difficult to quantify, psychological effect on both friendly forces and enemy forces when a dedicated CS aircraft is visibly present. That psychological dimension does not transfer perfectly to a standoff missile or a drone strike, however precise. The Army, throughout all of this, has been pursuing its own parallel solution, the attack helicopter. The AH-64 Apache is one of the most capable and most lethal battlefield helicopters ever built. In its current AH-64E variant, it is extraordinarily capable, with advanced sensors, Hellfire missiles, and the ability to work with unmanned systems. But the Apache has its own vulnerabilities. It is even slower and less survivable than the A-10 in high-threat environments. In war games and simulation exercises against peer adversaries, attack helicopters suffer devastating losses to modern air defenses. The Army has been wrestling with this problem, recognizing that the AH-64, for all its capability, is also a product of an era of permissive air environments that may be ending. The Army's Future Vertical Lift program is attempting to address the survivability problem with new designs, faster, with longer range, and better survivability features. But these solutions are years away from fielding, and their ultimate performance in actual combat remains to be seen. Here is what history tells us, with brutal and consistent clarity. When the services cannot agree on CAS doctrine, and when the Air Force deprioritizes the mission, soldiers die. When the Air Force builds and maintains genuinely capable and dedicated CAS forces, when it trains them properly, equips them properly, and integrates them properly with ground forces, it saves American lives on a scale that is difficult to exaggerate. The A-10, in its operational life from 1977 to the present, has saved more American lives than almost any other piece of military hardware in the inventory. The pilots who fly it, the JTACs who work with it, the ground commanders who have called for it in their darkest moments, they do not speak about it in the language of defense procurement or institutional competition. They speak about it in the language of survival. And the fight continues. Right now, in the Pentagon, in congressional offices, in the training centers where JTACs and air liaison officers work alongside soldiers, the debate about what close air support looks like in the next decade is ongoing and unresolved. The services have more joint doctrine, more joint training, more joint exercise experience than ever before. The JTAC system, for all its limitations, has produced some of the finest air-ground coordinators in the history of warfare. The technology available to CAS missions today, precision-guided munitions, digital targeting systems, data links between aircraft and ground forces, is incomparably better than anything available in Vietnam or Korea. In that sense, the story is one of genuine progress. But the underlying structural tension between an Air Force that fundamentally understands itself as an independent force pursuing strategic objectives and an Army that fundamentally needs a tactical partner willing to subordinate itself to the ground battle has not been resolved. It has been managed, papered over with agreements and joint publications and training programs, but not resolved. And every time budget pressure returns, every time a new generation of Air Force leaders looks at the mission priorities and finds the CAS mission at the bottom of their enthusiasm, the old wounds reopen. The soldiers who have been in contact, who have been pinned down, who have called for air support and heard that beautiful roar coming over the hills. They do not care about institutional politics. They do not care about the 1966 Johnson-McConnell Agreement. They do not care about Air Force procurement strategies, or the F-35's cost per flight hour, or the arguments about near-peer adversary air defense environments. They care about one thing. When they need air support, it needs to be there. It needs to be fast. It needs to be accurate. It needs to be lethal. And it needs to be flown by pilots who understand their situation and care whether they live or die. The A-10 Warthog delivered all of this, decade after decade, conflict after conflict. What comes after it, and whether it can deliver the same, is the question on which the future of close air support and potentially the lives of future American soldiers depends. The eternal Army versus Air Force shootout has no final referee. It has no scoreboard that everyone agrees on. It has no treaty that both sides fully honor. It has only the battlefield and the men and women who fight on it, and the aircraft either present or absent overhead. And it will continue in the halls of the Pentagon, in the budget debates of Congress, in the training fields of Fort Bragg and Nellis Air Force Base, for as long as the United States maintains separate ground and air services, which means almost certainly forever, because this is not really a debate about airplanes. It is a debate about institutional identity, about the nature of war, and about the oldest question in military history. When the soldier is fighting for his life, who is responsible for making sure someone is fighting alongside him from the sky? And until that question has a permanent, enforceable, culturally embedded answer, the fight goes on. Remember the BRRRT. Remember what it means to the man on the ground when he hears it. And remember that the fight to keep it there, overhead, when it matters most, that fight is just as real as any fight happening in any combat zone on Earth right now. This is close air support. This is the eternal shootout. And it is far from over.